Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
To our first guest today. Delighted he's on the programme. He is a distinguished Virginia State Senator and decorated veteran who flew helicopter missions in the Vietnam War and also served as a prosecutor with the US Army Judge Advocate General's Corps. He later headed up the Army's Criminal Law Division at the Pentagon. Now, he got our attention last year when he travelled to Syria to meet President Bashar al-Assad, and importantly, he presented a vastly different picture of the Syrian situation to that which was presented by the mass media. Hugely important. Let's welcome to the programme Senator Richard Black. Senator, thank you for taking the call. How are you?
Well, thank you for having me, Richie. I'm doing great, and I appreciate everything that you're doing over there.
Well, thanks so much. You know, your resume is absolutely amazing. It's incredible, really. There's so many things we could talk about in the time that we have, but I'm going to stick with Syria. A wonderful thing you did last year, ignoring what you were being told, you know, irrespective of who was telling you, ignoring it and going out to Syria yourself. Tell us, Senator, what did you find when you arrived in Syria as opposed to what you might have expected to find?
Well, I had studied Syria intensively for about 6 years, and it all began with the unprovoked invasion of Libya. And I thought, what are we after? What are we trying to do? And that led to the fact that we were seizing the huge supply of military weapons in Libya in order to ship them to Turkey and then across the border into Syria, where we would send mercenaries and terrorists from around the globe, and we would train them, we would arm them to topple the Syrian government, which was very popular with the Syrian people. And so I knew that when I went in, but what I really had was confirmation from people because they were telling me things that I knew already, and it always helps to double check your intelligence when you're doing this. But I did find that there is an overwhelming degree of support for President al-Assad, which was demonstrated by fair and free elections in 2014, which the West promptly disregarded as just not significant. And if you think of it, this is a country of 23 million people that has been attacked by 2/3 of the world. All the world's great economic powers, except for China and Russia, have attacked them. NATO, the UK, the United States, France, all of the Gulf states have flooded jihadists. And yet here is a little country of 23 million that has stood by its president. He still travels around Syria with rather sparse security. It's a little bit frightening when you realize it, and he has the total support of the Syrian government, the Syrian army, and the Syrian people, and that's what I saw everywhere that I went. And one of the things that most offends Syrians is the way that Westerners parse the various terrorists and what we call them this group and that group. Basically what you have is two variations of Al-Qaeda. They both stem from Al-Qaeda, one being ISIS, one being the Al-Qaeda and all of its allied terrorists. But there are no moderates. That's a myth. It has always been a myth. This is a war of terrorism launched by the West and by Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar against the sovereign independent nation of Syria. If you think of it, after the Second World War, we hanged people on the Axis side for wars of aggression, and yet we're fostering wars of aggression all throughout the Middle East.
What was incredible to me was I mentioned earlier on, you're a decorated veteran. You are. You're a man of the law, an incredibly distinguished career. And yet, you getting that message out when you came back home, trying to tell people, listen, there is another side to what we're being told. There is something very wrong with the narrative. You weren't naive, Senator, because you've been around long enough, but you still must have been surprised at the vitriolic attacks on you by the national media in your country. Instead of engaging with you and saying, okay, Senator, well, sit down with us, tell us what you saw, give us an impression of this man, Assad, what you got was, straight off the bat, condemnation, right?
Well, there is a deep state in the media. The media are woven together. The British media, the French, the German, the American media, they all are centrally governed in some sense. And there was a decision made early on that we're going to take down various countries and that we will have a single unified narrative. Now, I sent a letter to President Assad in 2014, and it essentially said two things. They had just scored a great victory along the Kalaman mountain range that separates Lebanon and Syria, and they freed a great number of the Christian-oriented villages there. So I said two things. I said, first, thank you or thank the Syrian Arab Army for its gallant rescue of the Christians, especially the 13 nuns who were being held as human shields. And I said, secondly, I cannot explain to you why the United States, which lost 3,000 people killed on 9/11 when the Twin Towers collapsed and a plane crashed into the Pentagon, why we have now turned and become allied with Al-Qaeda, which carried out this heinous attack on the United States. There was a huge uproar of the international media. Every nation, it seemed, on the globe attacked me. But I told people in the office, I said, everybody who calls to attack us, I want to personally speak with them. And when I told them what the letter said, they didn't always entirely agree, but I tell you, they very quickly stopped calling because they knew that what do you say? We're protecting Christians and we're against being allied with Al-Qaeda. How can you argue with those 2 points?
Absolutely.
So that really began to break through the barrier, and now we have other voices, and of course people like you who are very influential who speak out and are beginning to break this false narrative, this fake news about the Syrian war.
We're very lucky. Yeah, we have Syrian women, and we have a reporter in Beirut who comes on the program, and we ask the questions that the mainstream media should ask. We don't give people an easy ride all the time. But thanks for saying that. There's a couple of things I want to talk about. I want to talk about Turkey's motivation in the region. It's been announced today that Turkey might be buying an anti-aircraft defense system from Russia. Now, some people might think, well, that might not be a bad thing because Russia might be able to influence Ankara. But I want to talk about, Turkey and Turkey's interests in Syria in a second. But I'd like to ask you about your new president. It's been a roller coaster, and I know that's a cliche, but it's been a tumultuous period since the election, even before the inauguration. And a lot of people were very optimistic, Senator, by some of the things that Trump was saying pre the election. He said that, the days of intervention should be over. We don't have the rights to be going into countries, sovereign states, and dictating what happens. These were all very good noises. Now, he's appointed some people recently that definitely don't have a favourable opinion of Russia. And that's caused concern. And there's concern that maybe he's changing his stance on interventionism. Trump. Where is Trump on Syria? I know we don't have all night, and I wanted to ask you about, is there a stalemate in Syria right now and what's happening? We don't have all the time in the world, But let's talk about Trump for a minute. Good or a bad thing for the situation in Syria?
Well, with Syria, I think Trump has been fairly clear that he is not for regime change. I think he understands that regime change, it's a decision of either having a puppet government run by Wahhabists supported by Saudi Arabia, or you're going to have President Assad. It's going to be one of the two, and I think he understands that. You have to realize that President Trump is combating the deep state, the intelligence agencies that constantly are leaking information and undermining everything that he's doing. You would like to think that the people elect a president, the president implements policies, but for example, just recently, you had Senator John McCain blasting Senator Rand Paul. Now, John McCain is one of the most bellicose people on earth. I don't know why he hasn't urged us to declare war on Ireland, Iceland, or perhaps the UK. There is no war he doesn't love, and he got tremendously angry at Rand Paul because Rand Paul cast a vote against bringing Montenegro into the NATO. Well, Montenegro has an army of less than 2,000 people, and the country's only been in existence for 11 years. And it's simply another move towards the borders of Russia. Russia had, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, they had decided, we want a new way and a new day, and we want to be a part of the European experience. And because they collapsed the Warsaw Pact, and yet we kept in place NATO. Well, NATO ever since has been looking for excuses for their high pay and their good jobs. And the excuse has been that Russia is somehow this demon that threatens everyone. Well, it's foolishness. There's no substance to it, whatever. But yet they're on this path towards an eventual war with Russia.
Now, how dangerous is that, Senator? Is that a possibility? Do you see that as a genuine possibility further down the road if things continue the way they're going?
I really do. And, I've been a military man most of my adult life, and I've watched wars don't suddenly just spark off. Typically, they are planned well in advance, and then you diplomatically create events and so forth to move them forward. Now, at the end of the Cold War, we made firm commitments to the Soviet Union that we would not move NATO 1 inch to the east. And now here in successive waves, we've moved it further and further. And this great buffer that we had between the two nuclear powers when the Berlin Wall fell, now it's closing. And we risk a situation where, once again, we are toe-to-toe, two nuclear powers in a very tense situation where some inadvertent act could spark a thermonuclear war. There are people, the global elite, the boys from Davos, Switzerland, who gather and pontificate, they literally are willing to risk a third world war that involves thermonuclear destruction.
Senator, let me jump in there and forgive the interruption. This is a very important question, I think. You might think it's ludicrous, but I'll ask you anyway. This global elite and the cowboys in Davos, Switzerland, do they want this war?
Yes, they do.
They want it.
You have to realize that the global elite feeds off of war. And you look at Barack Obama's 8-year presidency. He was given the Nobel Peace Prize when he first assumed office on the belief that he was going to bring nirvana, and yet he's the only president we've ever had who has had uninterrupted combat throughout his entire 8 years of service in office. And so I think what you see, the war against Libya was deliberately done to capture weapons to feed the war in Syria. And also, Libya was a very financially responsible country that had 140 tons of gold, huge cash reserves, and all of that was plundered. Now, some people would like to tell you, oh, well, this was taken by those nasty rebels. Well, wait a minute. I thought these were great Democrats that we were supporting, not nasty rebel. And I don't think the rebels got the bulk of that cash and the bulk of that gold. I suspect that there are high-ranking officials from the United States, the UK, and France who have taken that gold and that enormous quantity of cash and converted it to Swiss bank accounts.
We have Senator Richard Black on the line. You can follow him on Twitter. I've already tweeted out his Twitter handle. Follow him there, @SenRichardBlack, @SenRichardBlack. We've got the Senator for another 10 minutes. He's busy. This is important stuff, folks. This is the reason why we broke away from commercial media to do programs like this, to speak with learned men who's seen combat up close and personal, who's worked as a lawyer, who's serving in the Virginia State Senate, who's telling it the way it is. It's vitally important that this information gets shared in the absence of the mainstream media coverage of this information. I mean, Senator, I saw you on RT speaking a few weeks back about Turkey's intentions for Syria, and I thought you were brilliant, and I thought, this is great. This man is making assertions, but he's backing them up with facts. These are genuine opinions. And the tragedy of it was, not everybody in the UK has access to RT. They get their information from the BBC and Sky News. And I thought the tragedy is, while people are seeing this, nowhere near enough people are seeing it. Tell us about Turkey. I mean, you spoke at great length about Turkey trading in oil and buying oil from these lunatic Wahhabi jihadists. You were so right on that. You think that Turkey wants to take a piece of Syria in a conflict, in a post-Syrian conflict world. Tell us about that and the Turkish intentions.
Yes, Turkey has invaded Syria and it has invaded Iraq. And both of these are unlawful wars of aggression. And there's now an effort, and it's interesting, I think the United States is actually trying to bottle up this incursion. It's, if you can imagine, a line that separates Turkey on the north and then Iraq and Syria on the south, and then a bulge, a sort of semicircular bulge going into Syria. They have a major military incursion. I read a report the other day that they had seized some additional Syrian villages, ordered the people to join the war against their country, and when some of them refused, they simply shot them to death. You need to recognize, and one of the big stories you might want to do, the Turkish constitution is on the verge of being changed, and it's going to make Erdogan an absolute dictator. In fact, he said in the lead up to this that he wanted powers similar to those of Adolf Hitler, and he will achieve these. There's going to be a referendum, but it's sort of predetermined that he's going to win. He actually will control the majority of their high court. He appoints cabinet members without confirmation. He can dissolve the National Assembly at will. It turns the National Assembly into a mere advisory body. He can declare states of emergency, and it abolishes all checks and balances. So Turkey will become an absolute dictatorship, much like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, our other two allies. And so you just have to wonder, what are we doing with them in NATO, where we have guaranteed that we'll defend their borders against against attack from others, and yet it's an absolute dictatorship. Powers like Adolf Hitler totally has abolished press freedom, has perhaps 100,000 political prisoners in inhuman conditions. It's slaughtering the Kurdish people, and it's invaded its neighbors. What are we doing committing the West to wholeheartedly supporting someone who really poses an existential threat to Western Europe?
And ironically, Senator, these are the things that Assad was accused of. And I very dispassionately looked at Assad when this began back in 2011. And I had a long, hard look back. And being a geopolitical journalist anyway, I knew that Assad was a very reluctant president. He got the job, of course, because of the death of his brother. And I knew that he wanted to reform Syria, and he was desperately keen to do that. Not only that, but the United Nations were constantly patting him on the back, saying he was achieving all these goals. It was a wonderful thing. How ironic that the very things he was accused of doing are going on in Turkey. Not to mention the absolute wretched state that is the state of Saudi Arabia when it comes to human rights. And of course, you know better than anybody, Senator, this country, the United Kingdom, we co-opted Saudi Arabia onto the UN Human Rights Council. Do you sometimes think that you've fallen down a rabbit hole and that you'll wake up sometime in the next few hours and this will all be just a bad dream?
Well, it is remarkable. If you look at Saudi Arabia, we call them our great ally. I know Britain does also. And here they are, a country which is an absolute dictatorship. They call him a king, but my advice, if I were an advisor to any dictator, I'd say, call yourself a king. People love kings.
Yeah.
But he's a dictator, and he has the power to behead people at will. Do you know that they didn't even take slavery off the books until 1962, and to this day, they have beheading and crucifixion as authorized punishments. Women cannot leave their homes without the permission and accompaniment of a male, sort of like somebody walking a dog. Only I guess they can let their dogs loose to go out, but they can't let their women loose. Yeah. The women are slightly lower than dogs in the Saudi scheme of things. It is a pathetic, despicable country. The religious values. Now, I know Muslims who are moderate, but they do not come from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is Wahhabist, which is the most primitive, barbaric form of Islam, and they are promoting it around the globe, and it is coming. It's coming to Europe. It's coming to the United States. It's being spread everywhere, and along with Wahhabism comes terror. And so we've seen this utter explosion of global terrorism that relates back to the time that we began working with Saudi Arabia to use terrorism as a tool of global manipulation.
Can I ask you a question on that, Senator? This might sound very conspiratorial, but I'll ask it anyway, because what you described there is basically how I see it. And this is also to the detriment of most of the ordinary Muslim men and women who just want to raise a family and get on with their lives like everybody else. Do you think, we spoke about the global elite and their plans for a protracted, serious thermonuclear conflict with Russia. Do you think that part of that plan, because I agree with you, we see it here in some places in the UK. I can't deny that there are pockets of radical Islam in places. I don't like admitting it, but I can't deny it either. But I often see that as an intended consequence of the meddling in the affairs of these countries. And one of the benefactors of it is the global elite, because while we spend all our time on talk radio, on national talk radio, arguing about Muslims and the burqa and the veil and extremism and mosques. It's divide and conquer, isn't it, Senator? We hate one another, and they carry on doing what it is they do.
Well, there's a rule in politics that says nothing ever just happens on its own.
No.
If you go back to the origins of all of this, now I love Ronald Reagan. I thought he was a great president, but he made a terrible mistake when he armed the Mujahideen in Saudi Arabia with modern arms. This was the genesis of Al Qaeda, and when that wasn't enough to overthrow the Soviet incursion into Afghanistan, he then accepted a proposal from the Saudi Arabians that they set up madrasas where they would train young Afghan boys, street urchins, and they would study nothing but Wahhabism day and night until they were just boiling over with hatred. And these were the people, these were the ones that eventually drove the Soviet Union from Afghanistan. But the problem is, it's the old story of Pandora's box. You can open the box to let some of the nasty creatures attack your opponent, but once they're free of the box, they go wherever they want, and when they're finished devouring your opponent, they turn and they devour you. And this is what has happened. What started with a handful of people in Afghanistan ballooned into a modest force in Afghanistan. And then when we began our policies of regime change with the so-called Arab Spring, which I think was a concoction of the intelligence agencies, when we did this, we have created an Al-Qaeda that is 1,000 times more powerful than it was when it left Afghanistan. It has roots in virtually every modern country on earth. And so there have been two very important pieces of legislation introduced in the U.S. Congress. The first was by Representative Tulsi Gabbard from Hawaii, a very liberal Democrat, and she introduced the Stop Arming Terrorists Act. And then just recently, Senator Rand Paul, who was truly a hero of the people, he introduced the same bill in the Senate.
Yeah, we saw John McCain's response to that, didn't we? John McCain, what an absolute madman.
The man is unhinged. I mean, he has always been a man of dubious intellect, but tremendous bombast, and he threatens and he bullies. He is a pathetic leader.
And he should know better, because like you, he served his country. And he saw the other side of it. He saw the horrors of war, as you did, Senator, and he should know better.
He was also one of the few prisoners of war who recorded a propaganda piece for the North Vietnamese while he was in captivity.
Yeah.
And I don't want to blame someone too much if they can't resist threats, but I will tell you that there were a lot of American pilots who died under torture rather than make these propaganda clips for the North Vietnamese communists.
That's right. That's always it's always been a criticism leveled at him, understandably. Well, I shouldn't say understandably, because I've never had to witness or experience the things you did. I'm mindful of the fact that I know you've plenty to do. I'm delighted you've come on the programme. I've got a final question for you, and I'd love you to come back anytime you have time, Senator. You're welcome back on this programme. We're delighted to hear you here in the UK and across Europe. Is democracy, is it now redundant? I mean, we talk about these elites and these oligarchs. Every time we go to the polls, we end up, now I'm not talking about you in Virginia, you're an absolute godsend, but there just aren't enough of you. We go to the polls and we're given a choice between two billionaires who have sold out to corporate interests and corporate entities. For me, it's the definition of fascism. How can we say we live in a democracy when we get to choose between people that are given to us by the system, and those people have nothing in common with us, and they're not serving us? So I'm not an anarchist, I'm not a communist, but I believe democracy is redundant. What do you think?
Well, it certainly is under enormous threat, and I will tell you that democracy, free government, as we know it in the United States, was hanging by a thread during the last presidential election. And I sat up late until about 3 a.m. with a couple of the icons of the conservative movement, with Morton Blackwell and Richard Viguerie. And each time we knew that the only way that Trump could win was to thread the needle. Everything had to go perfectly. And one by one, each thread would pass through the needle. And at the end, around 3 a.m, we looked at each other and we said, my gosh, he's won. And this is Richard Viguerie, he's about 85, I think. And he reached in his desk drawer and he pulls out a box with Chivas Regal. He says, boys, he says, I think it's time that we broke out the good stuff.
Right.
And he lined up water glasses. And frankly, I have never had so much Chivas Regal in my life. But I've got to say, if you're going to overdo it, an election like that was the time to do it, because it has given us a chance. It's just like Brexit has given
us a chance. But if I can be so bold, just before we part company, you're a rarity, and I'm not blowing smoke up your backside. You're a rarity. It's up to you and people like you to hold him to account, because the media, forget the mainstream media, but even the independent media have weighed in behind Donald Trump. It's up to you, if you see him surrounding himself with bankers and neocons, and if he rolls back on promises, we trust the rare men and women like you that you'll hold him to account and you won't support him. But I'm insulting your intelligence by saying that anyway, because where you see issues with Trump, you'll have the courage, of course, to speak about those issues, no doubt.
Yes, we will do that now. But keep in mind, here's the problem: when he proposes cabinet members, they have to be approved, and the important ones from our standpoint are the ones who have to go through the Senate Armed Services Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. There's an enormous degree of corruption among some of the senators on those committees, and he must get these people approved by these very bad committees, and so it's not that he doesn't want to put hardcore people in there, but he's got to get them confirmed. And so I think in his heart, I have come to believe, with some skepticism at first, I think he believes essentially everything he says. He believes it's true. He believes he wants to do it, and we're going to have to see how much he can achieve, and how much he's rallying the people. The people are, he just had a meeting in Tennessee where there were 9,000 people who poured out. There was a line that went 1.5 miles long, people waiting to get in, and of course many people couldn't get in. But it's this way everywhere. People want to hear a leader who will express the will of the people, and he is that person. And I think there is hope where there wasn't hope a year or two ago.
I hope I'm wrong, Senator, and I'll be the first to admit if I am. And I hope that he follows through. I'll be jumping up and down with joy if he holds true to his promise to stabilise relations with Russia and to roll and move away from US interventionism. Do you know, it was a tonic speaking with you today. It's made my day, Senator. Thank you. I want to tell our listeners, do follow the Senator on Twitter. His handle is @SenRichardBlack. It really was an honour, Senator, and I'd love to have you back on again in the future when you had some time. Thanks for your time.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you having me on.
It was a pleasure. The lovely Senator Richard Black on the line to us there from Virginia. Terrific to get his thoughts on Syria, on Russia, and on Donald Trump as well.